Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Isaacson, and with me is Danny Blue.
Hey, Eric, how's it going?
Pretty good, pretty good. We have a guest today, Mr. Brian Kardell. He's going to be talking with us about some web standards, platforms, and priorities. We'll go through some of that. But first, Danny with This Week in the Web.
Thank you, Eric. So first off, Babel 7.8 has been released with ECMAScript 2020 support by default, which is really cool. It's hard to believe that there's an ECMAScript 2020. I believe most people are still using for like module support being like ES 2015, which was 5 years ago at this point. So yeah. So a little bit older news, but definitely worth it. Microsoft Edge 79 has been released. So this is Edgeium. This is Edge that's running Chrome under the guts, which is really, really cool. So now we finally, Eric, you started this podcast 6 years ago.
Yep.
Something like that. We're talking when we were first getting excited about web components. But now we have them. And they're not contentious at all. But yeah, so go ahead and give that a shot, especially if you're on Mac, since Edgeium works on both. I don't know if they like it being called Edgeium, but it's how I differentiate.
It's pretty catchy.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. So Puppeteer, which is a node library with a high-level API to give you control over Chrome or Chromium. New version of that is out. It's version 2.1.0. Works with Chromium 80. And there's actually the ability to run Puppeteer with different browsers. There's, I think Microsoft has also been working on something like this. Is an interesting space to keep an eye on because it seems like there are several. I don't even want to say competing, but there are starting to be multiple solutions to this same thing. But Puppeteer is great. If you haven't used it, I highly recommend it, especially if you need to run your browser tests in a CI/CD environment. There's a new version of Material UI released, so React components for faster and easier web development. This is version 4.9. Some of the highlights are changes to the outlined input notch implementation to rely 100% on CSS. There are 11 patches on the autocomplete component, and there are slight updates to better match the material design spec. So we will put links to all of this stuff in the show notes.
Thank you, Danny. That was a mouthful, but it's been a while.
It has been a while. I do want to. We should also thank everybody that is still listening. We all just happened to get really, really busy at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, and so we're doing our best to get back into the swing of things. So thank everybody that is still subscribed, and hopefully we'll get back to a normal cadence here very shortly.
Cool. So Brian Kardell, if you guys don't know him, he can speak to himself as to what he's been doing lately. I follow a lot of his artwork as well, since he is a very good artist.
Thank you.
But he can explain kind of what he does, why he's on this show, and why we're talking about web standards again.
Sure. Well, I have been involved in web standards for a long time. It has primarily been as a web developer for most of my history. I was part of the jQuery Foundation standards team, and then the JS Foundation, and now the OpenJS Foundation. And about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, I had an opportunity to switch over to dev relations for a company named Igalia. And I have been really excited about Agalya for like a long time. So I jumped on that opportunity to throw myself into this more full force. And that is what I have been doing.
Excellent. And Igalia is one of those companies too, like that it's been around a long time. It's like one of those companies that you've never heard of probably, but it's done a lot of work on the platform from what I've seen over the years, since like 2002, I believe. Something like that.
Yeah. Agalya is really amazing. We work on all of the open source engines, which as of Danny's announcement is all of them now. So that is quite amazing. And I think we'll talk about some of the things that I think are relevant about that.
Okay.
Particularly how it impacts standardization, which is maybe not immediately intuitive. There is historically a reason that standards move at the pace that they do, and that some decisions in standardization are made, and it has to do with the fact that historically the web began as closed source things. I mean, in the very, very beginning, everything was open, but starting with Netscape and then Internet Explorer, we just basically moved into a closed source world. Opera was closed source. And that started turning around with Mozilla and KHTML, which became WebKit, which became also Blink, and yeah. So there's been a big change, and that has some interesting effects in that lots of people who aren't those companies directly can contribute.
Okay. So with standards and things like that, like most of our audience, not all, but most are developers. And when we look at standards, I think a lot of us are just like, well, what's the latest framework I can build
Right.
on?
Right.
Not like the web standards, like, oh, let's look at the web platform APIs, let's see what kind of HTML we can use. Why should developers kind of care? What are some of the pain points that you've heard from developers about this?
Yeah, well, I think there's sort of two sides of this, actually.
Okay.
One of those is how much should you care about those things directly?
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, developers are trying to accomplish a task. And very frequently, the raw platform is not delicious enough to be all that you need. So I think it's okay at some level that developers don't directly use the platform. People can debate that at some level, but ultimately the thing is, what makes all of those things possible is still the platform. So it's really important that we have a good platform, because what we're doing with standards is building out the commons, right? Like this is the thing that benefits everybody. And that's a really, really interesting idea, that you can get all of these companies and all of these people to contribute to building this foundation that makes really our whole world possible, and not do it in an open way that they can't claim like royalty and intellectual property, and like make it free and easier to distribute is amazing.
It is. I'm a big fan. I like to use the platform wherever I can over frameworks, but it's always like whatever we have to do to get the job done quickest to ship code, as Justin always said. So I totally get that. I'll tell you one story. Like some pain points that I've had with the platform are like, for instance, as an example, shadow parts, right? So shadow parts, if you're not familiar, is a spec dealing with the shadow DOM, which is part of the web components, and it's to fix some of the styling issues that we have with some of that. And so I'll go on to Bugzilla, and I'll be like, all right, let me just find the stuff that had all the tickets with shadow DOM, and then I'll find out shadow parts, and then I'll look and I'll be like, all right, last updated 2 years ago. Okay, and like still working maybe. Like there's no like update, like, okay, well, this is the current status of this, and I'm not trying to pick on Mozilla. I think this is like a difficult thing to find out about. And typically, something that I had a discussion with you earlier is that developers don't find out about the platform updates until the developer relations starts talking about those, or other developers even. So when you try and look for this stuff yourself, the discoverability the actual pieces of you're like, all right, well, this should be easy. I should be able to find a feature and figure out, since it's open source, how this will get implemented, or if it will even get implemented. So I can go back to my boss and say, you know what, we shouldn't invest in this technology for right now because it's not really here, or maybe we should experiment with it, in a few months when it's updated only in Chrome, because now it's Chrome and Edgeium, as we said before. But that's just one example. Like, could you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, so one thing is there are a million things like that. It's a really good example, but the platform is full of things like that, and you're keenly aware of that because you got interested in that one. So it becomes like a little kid waiting for Christmas morning. You're really watching that one closely, and you can be like, well, but it's been 2 years since I've seen anything in Bugzilla. But really, everything does generally take a really long time. And if you're looking for implementation issues in Chrome or WebKit or Bugzilla, I would say you are watching it way more closely than most people, because like you said, most people won't even find out about those until people really start talking about them, and not just developer relations people, the wider community. And this gets back into the thing that I said earlier, which is developers, they have a job to do. And this is all really interesting while it's still speculative, but when it actually helps them get their job done, which is the thing that you're trying to find out, when will it help me actually get my job done? That when the answer is yes, it's ready, then it will start getting a lot of attention. But yeah, it's all really, really slow, and it is very opaque and hard to track if you are tracking it, which can be really frustrating.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I found too with that is that, I always thought the grid, the spec for CSS grid, which is, kind of the to fix some of the things that Flexbox can't handle. So it's just a layout module. That went in pretty fast, I thought that originally, okay, this is a few months in, not when the original spec got created, obviously, but all the browsers had support, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, done.
Yeah,
that's all in there. But then I spoke with you earlier about it, and you said,
yeah, that's sort of the perfect counter example to the thing that I was saying, which is you weren't paying attention, so you didn't realize. Nobody was out there talking about it. Rachel Andrews was out there trying to talk about it for some time before, but the history of Grid and trying to solve the problems that Grid is intending to solve goes all the way back to 1996. And it went through various things, and Microsoft created what is more or less the modern Grid specification. And they did an implementation even, and then it just kind of languished. And actually, Igalia, the company that I work for, which again is part of why I think this is an interesting shift, we did the work in 2 of the browsers because it wasn't getting done. So we were able to take this feature that everybody was like, boy, this would be great if we had it, but a bunch of the browser engines were like, well, but we just can't prioritize that right now. It's not like we don't want to. It's just we can't prioritize it right now.
That could be frustrating. Developers can look at that and say, oh, well, it's not prioritized. What do you mean? This is way more important than getting a UI upgrade on the browser. What the hell?
Oh yeah, that is almost all of these things are actually way more boring and mundane and practical than you probably think they are. A lot of times it's not even about prioritization in the sense that we think X is more important than Y, but it's in terms of business prioritization. So think about your own product, and you might have a design team and an internationalization team, and they're different teams, right? And if you have an international people who are having trouble using your thing internationally, and they see your app update, and it just got this really nice new UI polish, but the internationalization stuff is still broken, your users will probably interpret that as you think design is more important than internationalization. But
Right.
in reality, it could be as simple as like the designers got done with another project early and they needed something to do. Whereas the people who would work on internationalization, they're running behind because they all got the flu. Like, so that like the company's priorities versus what actually gets done and why is actually way more complex than it seems on the outside based on just what gets done and what doesn't get done. So there's things that are going on all the time that make it more or less pragmatic for somebody to work on something or to get it done or to get it in their priority queue. And Grid, you were saying, happened really fast, but actually the work on Grid that we did took like, I think 3 years. Like it was a lot of implementation work. Like even once we got to that point, which took many years to get to that point. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty, you know, what's even more surprising to me, going back to a point that you had said about Agalia. When I first heard of the company, Agalia, I was like, I had never heard of it before, and I've been following a lot of things, right? And so when I looked at their history, that they're open source consultants, and that totally raised up a whole bunch of like, oh, they could be this, they could be that, they could be this. But then when you explained it to me, it was very interesting, like a conversation you could have is like, you could be in a meeting with a bunch of people who are working on the browser, like for instance, WebKit has very few people that work on that, right? Your company contributed last year way more than any other outside entity to WebKit itself.
And
So
to Chromium as well,
interesting
actually.
to me, like those conversations. Well, we can't prioritize this now, but then a company can come in and say, hey, you know what, we need that for our platform. Why can't you prioritize it? And then the browser will say, well, we don't have the funds. We don't have, you know, X, Y, and Z. And then they can contact your company and you guys can go in and do the work for them, working with the vendors and say, hey, look, eliminate all of the politics, eliminate all of the, I forgot what you had said specifically, so correct me if I'm wrong, eliminate all of that cost issue. You know, we want to help you. Tell us, you know, the rules for doing this and we'll do it. We'll do all the work for you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there are a lot of things that aren't controversial. They're just problematic to get prioritized in the queue because, like I said, you pay attention to the things that are interesting to you, but the web is enormous.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of things that are going on that are completely obscured from the outside. Like, why can't we get this? And that could be any number of invisible things. Like one that I think is worth talking about more is layout NG in Chromium. Like a lot of people don't know what that is.
Yeah, I thought it was an Angular thing or something.
Yeah, no, it's not. So it is this giant, I mean, really, really giant project to re-architect the layout engine in Chromium. There are a lot of reasons for that. And one of them is to unlock our ability to do all this work that has been impossible, right? So like, why can't we work on something like regions? Like, why isn't that getting done? Like, that was such an interesting idea, right? Exclusions, those kinds of things, like print related things. You have like print style sheets and you want to do like pagination or something like that. Well, at the core, a lot of this has to do with things like fragmentation. And as the web grew and it needed to get added to, we took on, 30 years worth of kind of like tech debt, like weird quirks, and we just couldn't get there. So this is a giant, like multi-year, multi-million-dollar effort to re-architect. And while this is going on, and even immediately when it's done, like the difference to developers is effectively nothing. More or less, right? Like more or less. There's no brand new feature or anything, but this work unlocks our ability to do all these other features.
Yeah.
And there's a similar
thing with companies, like you have that where it's like, we want to have the shiny UI, do all of these things, but hey, we actually need to have the data layer and the API layer updated to support this for the front end. So that's exactly. Sort of thing.
exactly. There's all kinds of examples like this, like colors. There's all these interesting things developing in what's called Colors Level 5, which is like pretty new. Is first real drafts out there now. But these ideas have been going for a while. But to get that, we need some of the things from Colors Level 4. So like if you want to ultimately arrive at Colors Level 5, we need to get the things for Colors Level 4 done. And some of those things are also sometimes like not things that developers are clamoring about. So they might even like land more or less invisibly to a lot of people, or you might think like, why would you prioritize this thing that nobody wants instead of my shadow parts, right? And like the answer might be because it unlocks all this other stuff and it's in a different segment. So yeah.
Okay.
Like another thing in here is like things like container queries. Like people think that, why is nothing happening with container queries? Why is nobody talking about it? But there is, in fact, really a lot. I mean, Agalya has spent a bunch of effort trying to find solutions, talking to other browser vendors. I'm going to actually publish a piece about that maybe later this week or next week.
And how does it work with the browser vendors coming together now? Because I know there's face-to-face talks sometimes across different countries. Like for the web components, that was done for sure. But I think it's different for each thing. And I think it's different for CSS. I think it's different for HTML. How does that all come together?
Yeah, it's different, but it's largely similar. For any given thing, you will have generally a communication through like IRC or something that's available all the time. Everybody uses GitHub and GitHub issues very, very heavily. And then you'll have at some regular cadence meetings through like this, right? We'll have like a teleconference or whatever and go through and have discussions. And then less frequently, and varies depending on the group, it's usually about 4 face-to-face meetings a year. And people get together and really a lot happens in those. Yeah.
Okay. And so let's say somebody outside of this process comes up with a spec they want to happen, or they want to know information. Like, how does that work currently?
Well, if you want to know information,
or not even a spec, right? But just like if somebody has an idea of like, this is the thing that we want to do. This is a general idea. Maybe they don't have that full, like a fully formed specification draft or something like that.
Yeah, if only the dialogue box could do this, or if only, details and summary could do this, like that's, I have this problem with my applications and it happens over a period of applications. So what do I need to do to get something done on this? This is my idea, right? I'm just using that as an example. But
Right. So if it's like a wholly new thing that we can't do, you are much better off like telling. So the place to do it is usually, if it is a wholly new thing, that should go to the incubation community group. So that would be WICG. We can share the link to that maybe.
And that's like a forum where you can kind of chime in on your feelings about a certain, or your experiences with on a certain topic that's there. Right?
Yes. So it's a discourse setup, and then there's a corresponding GitHub org with many repos in it. And the idea is that very frequently things start as this. This is like sort of a vague idea, a want from the platform, a bunch of use cases that we wish we could suit, or could be some small ad that it like doesn't require sort of a whole new spec or something. So the way you would bring it to that discourse, and people in standards follow that. And we will try to help shepherd it along or point you to where there's already work going on or past discussions that failed, and hopefully with the eye toward, can you present it in a way that doesn't fall down that way?
Right. And then from there, it could get once people kind of come to an agreement within the forum, does it go to someplace else to be worked on, or?
Yep. So from the forum, you sort of graduate. If you have a vendor who is interested, you graduate to in like a proper incubation that becomes part of like you get a repo basically in WICG. And then at some point, when the group feels like this is in pretty good shape, it will generally transfer into a related working group. So like if it's CSS, that would go into the CSS working group. But like frequently small things and small asks, you can just open as issues with the working group, especially something like CSS working group. If you have something that isn't just sort of a vague idea, or you have a complaint or something, you can take that to the CSS working group. We can share the link to that GitHub as well. You can open an issue and yell at us or whatever you want.
There's a lot of exciting stuff on that one too.
Yeah.
With this though, there's a lot of trying to think of the right wording for this, but there's no really discoverability that's like a central location. There's no really understanding, I think, in the community of, and I might be wrong on this. This is just my observation of where you go to find this information, how you find if it's updated. And I think most of us agree. If you're in software industry, priorities change. Things happen, but it's really difficult to find like a dead end. Like if you're looking on doing a search for like a half hour on something, and then like there's bugs that are outdated, or can I use tells me very vague information, and this isn't always the case, but I found this when you're trying to find newer specs coming about or updates to specs, updates to different new features and API type of things for the web platform. Do you think that there is? Am I wrong in this? Because that looks like the current state right now.
There are a lot of places where things are updated and where you can find their state, but there's many kinds of state here, right? So there's like the state of the specification, the state of agreement on the specification. Then there's the implementation state in terms of just simply done or simply working on it. And then there's, I think, part of what you are personally interested in some of these cases, like shadow parts, is like, but when, right? Like, are we 80% complete? Are we 70% complete? Am I waiting for this in like, you know?
If it's going to take 2 years, fine. Just tell me like as you go along where you're at.
Right. So that is very difficult. I don't know how that would be possible on big features, especially. And some projects are more sort of open about disclosing that information as well.
Especially dates, to say dates. And I totally get that, because as a software developer, I think we all have been there. But just to kind of say where you're at, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think especially with the dates thing, this is a thing that very much goes into the what were you paying attention to, and things take a really long time. Like, what does it even mean, the state of some of these things? So like you have mentioned summary details. So like, when was summary details done?
I thought it was fairly recent, but we had this discussion yesterday too.
Yeah. I mean, summary details goes like way back. And we started getting the first implementations of it. I should have looked up the facts before I'm on a podcast, but I mean, this is, pretty early HTML5 stuff. And I think we got the first implementations in like, I don't know, 2012 maybe? 2012 maybe, something like that.
2012, okay,
yeah. Maybe earlier than that. I don't know. But basically that was the first implementation. And then you had like maybe another 2 years until the next implementation. And then you had another couple of years until the next one. And I think the last implementation, I think, also happened when Danny said Chromie Edge became a thing. So yeah, I mean, that is when you can say it is definitely done. It is definitely standard. There is no browser that doesn't support that. I mean, that's a long time, right? And it depends on what you mean by done. How much are you willing to like work around the limitations of that or whatever? I think this is actually one of the things that is really interesting about Igalia is like that kind of thing is very much easier to compress, right? Like that kind of thing has a lot to do with just simple prioritization. There's no reason it has to be that way. I think we can help with that stuff, which is great. Like it would be great for developers and companies, because like not having those features is difficult. Trying to track through this is really hard. Trying to work around not having it, and it's very difficult.
Yeah, I'm trying to just understand, like, as far as like, so this like, for if I have a JavaScript thing I'm trying to follow, or a CSS thing to follow, everything starts at WICG is my understanding, right? You go to the forums, you look through that.
WICG is the most obvious place to start new things, but some things are like pretty well established in a working group already, and it's pretty clear that it belongs there. And there's nothing immediately new about it in a certain sense. So like some things can begin in CSS working group. Does that make sense? Like you mentioned also a JavaScript thing. So like most JavaScript things will start on like in TC39 itself. They'll start in TC39 discourse, or you create a straw man and you provide it to TC39 members, and that will turn into a stage 1 proposal. I don't know, maybe like do you find the stages thing easier to follow, or better, or worse, or?
I was just going to ask you if you could kind of briefly go over what the various stages are, because I think sometimes it gets thrown out, especially people that follow maybe like TypeScript or Babel or something like that, where they'll be like, oh, we will only implement something once it's reached a certain stage, right. Or people talk about, oh, it's in proposal, but it's only stage 1 and it's lost its champion or something like that. So can you briefly go over what those stages are, and like, not importance isn't the thing, but like how close is each stage to actually being implemented by browsers?
Yeah, well, I don't know that there is actually a single finite answer to that question, even in the stages, which is part of why I asked the question. So stage 0 is basically like, it's an idea that they're talking about that hasn't been thrown away. So like anything can be stage 0. Stage 1 is that basically committee thinks it's appropriate to talk about. That's kind of the bar, right? Like it seems interesting enough to do more work on. It doesn't seem like inherently problematic. It doesn't seem like a complete waste of time, so
warrants discussion.
Yeah, right. Then stage 2 and 3 are like just progressions of like how sort of like how ready it is and what the status is. Like, do you have tests, and do you have any implementations? How mutable is the spec at this point? But
So would you
think
say
that-
it's fair to say that by the time something's in stage 3, there would be somebody has hacked together an example implementation of it?
Oh yeah,
So-
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're stage 3, like you're getting implementations and tests, and but you said browsers, and like that doesn't necessarily mean maybe what you're thinking.
Okay.
Because there are other JavaScript engines, right? So they also count, right? You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, yeah, that totally makes sense. I guess one of the reasons I mentioned browsers is that there are some things that go through the spec process that are not JavaScript, right? That would have to be implemented inside of a browser.
Right. Yes. So, there's multiple JavaScript engines, and some of those engines are also in browsers. And when we're talking about the stages, it's not like browser is not the limiting factor for those, more or less. But you can derive some level of completeness based on, like, once we have these implementations, the cost of changing our mind and the willingness to change our mind, and like what we're going to break, it's getting more and more serious. So so the odds that will eventually get done is very, very high. But at the same time, like, it actually getting done ultimately comes down to the priority of getting it done.
Yeah. So how does and I know, like, that some of the questions I'm asking don't have like very clear cut answers, but I know I've seen some discussion around it, especially when because there might be something that seems very obvious from the outside that's actually very complicated on the inside to actually implement. But so how does something go from, let's say, like, so something goes from stage 0 to stage 1, which seems pretty, it's like, this is okay to have more conversation. Mm-hmm. Like, how exactly how does something move up, let's say, from stage 2 to 3? And I understand there's some things that go into that. It's like, do you have implementations? Do you have tests that prove it, or something like that? But is it literally just a committee just says, yes, this has passed whatever criteria we expect for this stage, and it's free to move on to the next?
So it is ultimately the committee that looks at the data and says, did you meet that or not?
Okay.
Right. Like anything else. Let me give you an example that is not TC39, but for W3C. So, like, when do you have interoperability? Like, when can this move into a rec status? So there used to be some text that says, like, you have to have 2 interoperable implementations. But then you have a spec that has 10,000 things, and HTML was a recommendation for a long time, and yet we just got the last summary details. And I think the last one before that we got was only like last May or something like that. So how does it get to be a recommendation if they're still lacking uneven implementations? It is a really hard, thing to, like, we have words, right? But I think what I was saying is, like, at the end of the day, what you really care about is it stage 2? Is it stage 3? Is it stage 4? Is, like, can I use it?
Yeah.
And these stages are useful in, like, when you want to pay early attention to things, because, for example, you think you might contribute to the discussion, or you might like to try out polyfills in Babel or something like that. And like knowing where this is at is really mostly useful to you in terms of your own comfort level for mutability, right? So like if something is very early, it's still subject to pretty significant changes, which means if you try it out, it's great. Like it helps you get your work done. And if you don't like it or you have problems or it's not meeting your use cases, you can provide feedback into the system, and that's awesome. But they can change it and then all your code can break, right? But if you're using it with Babel, then it's more like a compiler. So like that's always the case with things that you compile.
Yeah.
But like the web can't break. The web is the one thing we can't break.
Yeah, and it's like because there have to be certain things that are more difficult, because I feel like JavaScript APIs, let's say you want to add a new array method or something like that, right? That seems like a more straightforward, not to go through, not to bring up how difficult it is to name things. If anybody remembers Smooshgate, but it feels like for JavaScript it could be much easier because you can polyfill it. So you know that you could get it implemented, and then it's much easier for other people to use. There are certain things. I think Shadow DOM has been a really good example of one of the reasons that I think it's been, like we've got it now and it's very good now. But I think one of the reasons it was difficult to get people on board, especially early on, regardless of any actual legitimate issues with the spec and with the implementation, is that it's very, very hard to polyfill those types of features. Same for a lot of more complicated CSS features as well, like anything, like CSS grid and Flexbox, those types of things. Those are very difficult to have good backups for. And so with that, it seems the JavaScript ones are pretty straightforward. Does any of that come into play when specs are being defined? Is how is not really backwards compatibility, but like how easy is this going to be for people to polyfill in userland?
So it absolutely is part of the discussion. It is not a criteria officially, but for example, the Extensible Web Manifesto, which I helped create, is like it calls these things like basically fundamental primitives, like things that you can't polyfill, new powers, effectively, more or less. Obviously, you have to like identify when those are, and then maybe think about your problem differently. Like, I think that there's an argument to be made that those deserve a special priority, like a special way of thinking about them. But things that are polyfillable are really good for that. And so that, like, whether it is actually officially part of any criteria or not, I think it is just more appealing when we have ideas that can be polyfilled, because that leads to this like this path to standardization that is good for developers. Because again, at the end of the day, you're trying to get your job done. There's no incentive for you really to participate in a years-long discussion that's words on email, right? But if somebody says, this is kind of what it's going to be, you can use this Babel thing and it will be that. You can say, yes, that is terrible, actually. I don't like that at all.
And I think that's actually something you said just a second ago is perhaps even a better way to phrase my question, where it's not is this polyfillable, but when something is more if you are able to polyfill something, you can potentially count on adoption of a certain API or a certain feature being a little bit more if it's easier to adopt, more people will adopt it. And if that is, and I think maybe that's where that's a better way of phrasing what I was trying to ask before.
I think that is absolutely true. In fact, like a whole bunch of the talks and things like blog posts and talks that I have given talk about this. When HTML5, when it was called HTML5, was created, like Internet Explorer controlled like 95% of the market, and they no longer had a team. Like they had given up. They were working on Silverlight. Like they were working on the next web, just like everybody else was. And so even when like Safari came along, like WebKit, and we're like, look, we finally have some implementations. It's like, yeah, but like there is absolutely no incentive for me to burn any time trying any of this stuff out because it doesn't work anywhere. Like it works in barely any browser. And I think the thing that really absolutely like got us there is polyfills. When people started polyfilling those features, that was the way that we got there. Sometimes I think it's like the only way to get there. So I think identifying those brand new powers and like treating them specially and making sure we get them done because they are very special things isn't definitely an important part of the conversation.
No, I think that's a very interesting thing that sometimes sometimes gets left out of the Twitter conversation.
Yeah. So this thing about priorities and like when things get done and how they get done and everything. I think this is a really interesting problem to talk about. I'm glad that you had me on so I could talk about it a little bit. Because as developers, I think it's really difficult to know, and it can be really, really frustrating. And for some things, there's good answers, and for some things, there's not good answers. But more than ever, since things are open source, we have the ability to like help shape it. And Igalia is really enables a lot of that. Like we held up grid, but like resize observer we did as well. CSS text markers, public private class fields in JavaScript, big integer, and now just as of today, advanced to stage 1, I think, big decimal, which is cool. Tuples, we're getting MathML done, which has been stuck for a really long time. There's all kinds of opportunity here for us to do new, exciting things. So I'm super excited about that. And I'm super excited about trying to bring it to regular developers. We're gonna try some things this year to maybe help developers help the priorities, like help pick the priorities. So
excellent.
See how that goes. I expect it will be similarly like not smooth because people won't all agree, right? It will be similarly uneven. Not everybody will agree what the priority should be, I expect.
Probably true. Yeah. So that's we gotta stop in like a minute or so. Is there anything you want to leave the listeners off with as far as these priorities and platforms and getting involved or anything like that?
I think if you're interested in any of this, reading more about it, you can check out my blog. I've written a couple of blog posts about this and some of the work that I just mentioned. And if you have ideas for features that you think would be good priorities that seem uncontroversial, you can hit me up on Twitter, and that would be great.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking out time and coming on, and thank you also for spending some time to prep for this. I know it's a lot to do, so we really appreciate it.
Thanks.
And I guess we'll see you all next week.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. And bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.